From when I was a bocher, 20-something years ago.
A million years ago, in a different lifetime.
In a different lifetime.
Yes, it was.
Round one. And now is the staff member of Achet Mimim in Crown Heights, Mashpia, on Inside Hasidus, and he's giving us the history of Yud-based Thomas and implications to us.
With Hashem's help.
Without any further ado, Rabbi Paltiel.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. I guess there's 2 points. The first point is the story of Yud-based Thomas, what happened. And the second is why we're still talking about it. It happened 97 years ago. In 1927. Now it's 2024. The truth of the matter is the story is very important, but the relevance to us is far more important. So I'll divide my time. We have about, 40 minutes. I'll divide my time. I'll tell you some of the story. The story is very, very involved. And so if you want to hear the long version of the story of Yud-based Thomas, you can find it online. I'm giving you 20 minutes worth, but I have I just sent out my everything person, my angel sent me a page of advertisements to the website for various classes, which I posted in all the different groups that I have. So you can listen to the story in greater detail if you so desire. The story basically is that Yiddishkeit in Russia, until let's say 1890, let's use that date, 1890, although you could, if you wanted to, say 1865. But let's say till 1890, it was thriving. Jews were very poor. They were really materially very, very poor. But they were spiritually very, very rich. They lived, for the most part, shtetl lives, simple lives. They were not rich at all. They had very little money, but they had very meaningful lives. And of course, amongst them, there were many Talmidei Chachamim. The brightest and the best went to the best yeshivas in the world. Bar none. We're in Russia. And in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, some of the greatest minds of Torah of the last 2 centuries or 3 centuries lived and learned and taught. Now, the winds of change had been blowing for a long time, and there's a number of undercurrents that explain those changes. But as far as Jews are concerned, it was anti-Semitism. The Russian government, the Tsarist Russian government, was not only anti-Semitic. It used anti-Semitism as a politique. Whenever the citizens of Russia were not happy with the government, they'd arrange pogroms. It was a distraction technique. Instead of hating the government, they hate the Jews. And over the years, there were multiple pogroms where many, many, many Jews were killed. A lot of property was destroyed. And it made living in Russia very, very difficult. And it does explain why, beginning in the 1880s, Jews began to mass emigrate to the United States. And you may not be aware, but there was also what we would call today an aliyah. Many, many Jews went to Israel in the 1880s and 1890s. It was a reaction to the anti-Semitism. The numbers that I like to use as a means of giving you a concrete sense is this. Just think about the numbers, okay? In 1890, 5,650. 9 out of 10 Jews in the world was Orthodox. In 1940, 50 years later, 9 out of 10 Jews in the world was not Orthodox, was not Frum. That's unbelievably rapid. The decline of Jewish religiosity was so radical. It's impossible to fathom how quickly it happened. And then after the Second World War and the establishment of the State of Israel, Sephardic Jewry began to suffer similar effects because they had to move because they could no longer live in Arab countries. It's been a very difficult century and a half, let's just put it that way. If you know Jewish history, the last 150 years have not been so delightful. And things began to change. It changed first slowly, first quietly, that, and I guess the language that you would want to use is that from Jews, Orthodox Jews, were looking out. They were looking for solutions to the suffering in their life outside of Yiddishkeit. And of course, there were movements, there were underground movements. In Russia, there were underground movements because they were illegal, which would be known as the age of the isms. You know, everybody belonged to a group where they'd sit in bars or beer halls, and instead of talking about baseball or, I don't know what, Biden and Trump, they would talk ideology. You know, some were anarchists and some were monarchists and some were Democrats and some were socialists and some were communists and some were Yiddishists, some were Zionists. They all had the same last name, Ism. You know, the first name changed. And it was an age of revolution. It was an age of revolution. The whole world was preoccupied with making a better world because the world in which they lived was hard. It's not so complicated. In other words, if we have the advantage of hindsight, when you look back at that period, you understand that period with greater objectivity than they could have seen it. All of the suffering came down to how are we going to make our lives better. And the beginning of that was beliefs. Beliefs. This ideology, this ideology. Each ideology was offering hope. And many, many, many Jews were swept away by these isms. They were looking for their lives to become easier. They're looking for their lives to become safer. And they were also looking for their lives to become more comfortable, not so impoverished. Now, in Russia, so of course, this revolution happened in the whole world, but in Russia, it was the Communist Revolution, which took place in 1917, where an extreme group of socialists, which we call communists or Bolsheviks, took over the government and they asserted themselves on Russia. There was, as you may be aware, a civil war which went on for about 4 years, from 1918 till 1922. During that civil war, as was the case in each earlier occasion when there was unrest in Russia, many, many Jews were killed in pogroms, not as soldiers. They were just killed in pogroms because there were these 3 different factions fighting over Russia. The one thing they agreed to is that they all hated Jews. It was a very, very difficult time. And the Soviets finally consolidated their power around 1922. Lenin was the first leader of the Soviet Union, as I'm sure you know, who was followed by Stalin in Marshemai, and they began to assert their philosophy, their ideology, their hope, their belief. Now, communism is an economic system. It's a redistribution of wealth taken to its extreme. That's what communism is, right? Everything belongs to the state, and the state, quote unquote, divides everything equitably, although equity apparently also has levels. It's not exactly equal, but that was the philosophy. Ideologically, it's a wonderful idea, right? For us all to share all the wealth sounds like a great idea. Practically, it's untenable. Can't work. Why? Because if you take away from people incentive and motivation and competition, nobody works. And that's what happened in the Soviet Union. And the system corroded, by 40 years ago, 35 years ago, that system collapsed on its own dead weight. It's not a sustainable system. But for reasons which are hard to understand or are not necessary, the Soviet Union, the ideology of communism, believed that part of the revolution was against God. There's no reason an economic system has to fight with religion. Leave religion alone. What did religion do? But it was axiomatic to the Soviet Union, it was axiomatic to the communist government that they had to kill God. And if you know Russian Jews, they did a very good job. It's been 35 years since the Soviet Union has collapsed, or whatever, 30 years. But they did a very, very good job of ripping God out of the hearts of the people, Jews and non-Jews. And Russia, which really was a center of the highest level of Jewish religiosity, I'm speaking about Yidden specifically, suddenly fell on incredibly hard times. It became impossible because they began to pursue all clergy. If you were a Rav, if you were a Sheikhet, if you were a Moyel, if you were a Malamed, if you held any kind of position that was part of the infrastructure of supporting Jewish religiosity, they accused you of not working. And in a system which is all about rabatu, it's all about work and redistribution of wealth, if you are a parazit, as they would call it, if you're a taker and not a giver, you became a burden to the state. They take away your apartment, they put you in jail. And they ran away from Russia. Many, many, many very prominent rabbis and leaders ran away from Russia. They went to other places. They went to Poland. This is before the First World War. After the First World War, Poland was a place for Jews to live. And other places. They went to Germany, they went to Austria, some even went to Israel, but they left Russia. The Frierdiker Rebbe had just assumed, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Yossi Yitzchak, I carry his name, had just become a Rebbe in 1920. And he was a new Rebbe who followed his father, who had built a very, very, very successful and strong yeshiva, which was that a very, very high standard of academic learning in Lomdus, in Nigla, and Chassidus, but it also was unique. It was designed where you came to this yeshiva not just to study Torah, you came to this yeshiva to learn how to be a Jew. In other words, if you have to explain what separates Chassidus, in Chassidic culture, the priority is never forget that you're serving God. Serving God. And in the Lubavitch Yeshiva, in Time Chetmimim, that was very, very important. The kids who studied in that school were very intelligent. They did very well academically, but they also, at a very young age, I mean, it's kind of hard to talk to people who are 15 or even 20 about God. It takes a long time to appreciate how earnest that is. They created an army of young Chassidim. When the previous Rebbe became Rebbe, and the Civil War was over, and the communists began to consolidate their power, they went after religion. All religions, the Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. They went after the Muslims, although the Muslims were less cooperative, they fought back. The Muslims were in Asiatic Russia rather than in European Russia. And they went after the Jews. And a lot of Jews capitulated. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes in his letters that I became the head of the movement to fight for Yiddishkeit in Russia because there was a vacuum. Many other Gedolei Yisrael, great Rabbonim and Rosh Yeshivas and Tzaddikim left. And the Frierdiker Rebbe undertook to fight for Yiddishkeit. Now, what you have to understand about that fight is two things. Number one, he organized an underground network of yeshivas, and he taught thousands of children. He had chadarim all over Russia. There are lists which he wrote then that he had to prepare for the American joint who were paying the bills to show them where the money is going. He was teaching thousands of children Torah all over Russia in these underground chadarim. They were not schools with buses and lunches, you understand. There were a few kids here, a few kids there, but it was an enormously successful effort. Your grandfather, your father's father is younger, but your father's father's father, your great-grandfather, in other words, my grandfather's generation, even before my father's generation, learned in these chadarim. It was very, very successful. But there's the other side of that coin. And the other side of that coin was he was really fighting a losing battle. Russia had millions of Jews. Millions of Jews. And what percentage of Jews were prepared to go to Siberia because they want to teach their children Aleph Beis? What percentage of Jews were prepared to lose their apartment because they wouldn't work Shabbos? Now, again, as recently as 1890, that means 20 years before, the vast majority of these people were frum. But there was so much difficult, so much pain, so much suffering, so much poverty, so much anti-Semitism. And then there was this, that Jewish people very, very quickly, relatively speaking, they couldn't afford to keep Shabbos. It was losing their home. They couldn't afford to send the children to a Jewish school. They take their children away from them. They couldn't afford to keep kosher. So the Rebbe was fighting a battle for the diehards. In the Soviet Union, in the 1920s and the 1930s, the Jews who held on to Yiddishkeit were the most devout, the most righteous. And to be very direct, in Russia, under those conditions, there was no such thing as a chassid, there's no such thing as a mitznagid, there's no such thing as a Lubavitcher, there's no such thing as a koiden event. If you were one of those people, you belonged to the same group. In other words, the Jews in Russia who were prepared to be Mesiras Nefesh for Yiddishkeit, which was a relatively speaking small percentage, it was tens of thousands of people, but out of millions of people, in various places, banded together underground, and they did what they could to keep their children from. By default, it became a Lubavitcher project because, for the most part, the Frierdiker was the only one who stayed in Russia. And he also left behind, when he left in 1928, which I'll speak about momentarily, he left behind his army, he left behind his Hasidim, who continued doing this work till the collapse of the Soviet Union. It never stopped. Till the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 90s, there were Lubavitcher Hasidim who were carrying that torch forward from their fathers and their grandfathers from the time the previous Rebbe was in Russia. So if you think realistically and objectively about what the previous Rebbe did in Russia, and I think it's important to appreciate this, although it's hard to appreciate it and it's hard to understand it. No, it's hard to sense how strong this is, and it's even hard to understand why it was worth it. He was fighting a losing battle. The Frierdiker Rebbe was fighting a war he could not win without the help of God. Hashem could do whatever he wants. He was fighting to fight. Historically, Jews fight for all kinds of causes. The way it works with the Jewish people is when someone starts up with the Jews, it becomes God's job to defend us. When someone starts up with God, it becomes the Jews' job to defend him. And that's the difference between the story of Hanukkah and the story of Purim. The Purim story was they started up with the Jews and God had to defend us. The story of Hanukkah was they started up with God, so the Jews had to defend God. And that was the Mesiras Nefesh. That was the sacrifice of the Chashmonoim. The Chashmonoim should never have won. The Maccabees should never have defeated the largest and strongest army in the world. Koyanim, people never held a weapon. It was a miracle that's unimaginable. But this is what happens. Sometimes you don't fight to win, you fight to fight. To make a statement, you see? And this is called Kiddush Hashem. You're fighting a losing battle, it could cost you your life, to sanctify the name of God. It's something that we always say, please don't test me, I'm happy my grandfather went through it and not I. Nobody wants such a test. But it brings out of people a determination and a strength that's it's super rational. It doesn't make any sense. I'll just give you an example. My father lived in Moscow with a sister and a brother, and his father. My father's mother died when my father was 2 years old. So my father's father, whose name was Paltiel, was raising 3 children alone in Moscow, working for the central bank of the Soviet Union, going to shul on Shabbos. He did everything in his power to teach his children about Yiddishkeit. But he had no delusions. In other words, his kids were going to get bigger. And what options did they have? There was an underground yeshiva for the boys. There was no underground yeshivas for the girls, which is why in many Hasidic homes, the boys were going on Mesiras Nefesh and the girls were going to the theater. It was tough. It was very difficult. They didn't yet have an understanding that you have to teach girls as you have to teach boys. But what was my grandfather thinking when he woke up my father at 2 o'clock in the morning to show him Aleph Beis? When my grandfather named each of his children, my uncle's name was Eliezer, my aunt's name was Miriam, my father's name is Abba. He gave them each one Hebrew name for one reason. He wanted them to remember the Hebrew name. And he felt if they'll have one name rather than 2 or 3, it'll be easier for them to remember. The attitude was, I don't know what's going to happen. No one dreamed that their children would be able to hold on to their values. But they fought. They fought for principle. You understand? They fought. You had to fight. And this was the attitude of the previous Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe fought this war in the Soviet Union to fight, to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim B'Rabba. You know that it says in holy books, says in Sefer HaChinuch, that the biggest tzaddikim, holy people, sometimes understand, the classic example of this is the story of Hanukkah. Some fights you have to fight not to win, you have to fight to fight. And if you merit, if you're Zoicha, the miracle happens. As per the story of Hanukkah, we don't begin to understand how great a miracle it was that a handful of Koyanim defeated one of the largest armies in the world. It doesn't make any sense. It was an unbelievable nace. But the miracle didn't start with God. The miracle started with the sacrifice of the Chashmonoim. This was the situation in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and the 1930s and 1940s, even the 50s and 60s. The Frierdiker Rebbe was fighting, again, the way I see it, a losing battle. It had to be fought. And the end of it was, they arrested him in 1927. The day they arrested 20 clergy all over Russia. Most of them were not Jews. Most of them were Christians and perhaps some Muslims. They took him into a cell and shot him that night. In other words, they took the most powerful religious leaders all over Russia, killed them before the world could cry out. The previous Rebbe was arrested the same night, and he was told to go to a certain room, but he wasn't told what time he had to go into the room, so he sat down to smoke a cigarette in the hallway. That's the story. It was such I had the presence of mind. What's my rush? I can go there in an hour. And somebody saw him in the hall, and once word got out that they had taken the previous Rebbe and he was still alive, the pressure from the rest of the world made it impossible for the Soviets to come. They wanted to kill these people before there could be an outcry. And he spent 18 days in jail. During those 18 days, he experienced repeated, violent beatings. They beat him violently over and over with a stick. They beat him till his blood was splurting all over the place. The Rebbe, by 1933, which is 5 years later, began to show paralysis and multiple sclerosis, all kinds of physical illnesses. By the time he came to the United States of America, the Rebbe could barely speak and barely walk. Can be traced, at least in part, to the suffering in those 18 days. They beat him repeatedly. They beat him to the inch of his life. And he was defiant. He wouldn't make eye contact. He insisted on talking in Yiddish. They were all a bunch of Jews, unfortunately, the early communists. He was very defiant. He acted like as if he had no opposition. And they punished him for it. Anyway, they had no choice but to let him leave because of the pressure from the world, because word got out. And first they sent him off to exile it was initially supposed to be for 10 years of slave labor, and that was commuted to 3 years of exile. He spent 9 days out of his 3 years in exile, and then they sent him home. When he came back home, he made a very, very unpleasant discovery. And the discovery that he made was that he was free, but the whole of Russia was a prison. In other words, any chassid who came next to him went to jail. He was untouchable because too many people outside of Russia liked him. And he realized that he became the obstacle to the continuation of the underground activities. In other words, when the previous Rebbe was in Russia, there was an address. The Soviet Union knew who is leading the efforts at holding on to Yiddishkeit. As if it's such a big aveda, such a terrible sin that you want to teach your child to Chumetz Halacha. What's the sin? Why does it bother? Why does it bother this massive empire with incredible power that you put on, you send your kid to shul? What's the big deal? But for some reason, they had this religious need to stamp out religion. And the previous Rebbe defied them, so they had to stamp him out. So he left. I like to say, and I believe this wholeheartedly, that when the previous Rebbe walked out of the Shpalerka prison alive in Tesvav, Gimel Tammuz, Tafresh Bezayin, he was the most surprised person in the world. Meaning, the Rebbe Rayat, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he undertook this effort of Mesiras Nefesh, and I want to repeat those words again, Kiddush Hashem, to sanctify the name of God, he had no exit strategy. He had no idea how it was going to end. He knew that he needs to fight. He knew that he needs to defy them. He didn't think about his own life for 1 second. His survival was not by his efforts. It was entirely God's, because he recklessly threw his life away. But he had to leave. He had to leave. He had to leave Russia because he became an obstacle to the continuation of the work. And when he left, it went underground in what you like to call cells. Instead of a centralized undertaking, in every community there were Yidden who practiced Torah mitzvahs, and they didn't want to know about one another. In the Soviet Union, if you did not need information, you didn't want information. If they call you in and they beat you, and they say, tell me this, that, and the other, you didn't want to not share information, you didn't want to have the information that they could beat out of you. And this went on the entire 70 years of the Soviet Union. Until the so Stalin killed people. Stalin killed so many Hasidim, you have no idea. A lot of the Hasidim got out after the Second World War, 1946, 47, as did my father. But many of the Hasidim stayed behind. His father's father came out of Russia in the 70s, late 60s. And the work never stopped. The effort at keeping an ember, a little fire of Yiddishkeit alive in Russia, in many places, in big cities, in Russia, in Moscow, in Leningrad, and other places like that, was never interrupted. And one generation after another, there were grandchildren of Hasidim who were alive during the revolution, still keeping Shabbos. You understand that not just the kids who learned in yeshiva and then the revolution happened, they held on to the Yiddishkeit. They trained their children, and their children trained their children to be Mesiras Nefesh, to sacrifice their lives to the mitzvahs. And it continued mamish till the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when the previous Rebbe came out of Russia, he announced a Yom Tov, a holiday. On the date of his release, which is tonight, the 12th of Tammuz, Yud Beis Tammuz, he made it into a Yom Tov. And he said that this holiday is not my personal victory, it's a victory for Yiddishkeit. Now, I like to say that the reason he made this Yom Tov, I said it to you a minute ago, is because he knew that he survived because of God saved him. He didn't save himself. So he saw this as a sign from heaven. But he also saw it as the beginning. He saw his victory, his personal emancipation, his personal survival, as an omen that one day this evil empire would go away and you'd be able to be a Jew in Russia. Keep Shabbos and kosher and all the rest. Now we're living in that time. It took a very, very long time for this to materialize. But he felt, the previous Rebbe felt, that his defiance, his Kiddush Hashem, his readiness to sacrifice his life for the sanctification of the name of God and those of his followers and all the Yidden in Russia, and there were many of them, who were defiant without any limits to hold on to Jewish tradition and Torah mitzvahs, that sacrifice, that defiance, that sanctifying of the Eibishter's name was the receptacle, was the keli for the nest to happen. This is it's a brief version of the story of Yud Beis Tammuz. I mean, the story has so many details. I've just given you a sense of the history.
What is it that they wanted to get out of him when they were like torturing him? Were the haters and the yeshivas were, or what is it they wanted to know from him?
For the previous Rebbe?
Yeah.
Well, they wanted him to stop.
Oh, okay. They wanted him.
They wanted him to stop,
okay.
And the best way to stop is to make it too costly. When it used to happen, they would arrest a Malamed, send him to Siberia. The next day there was another Malamed. Then that Malamed would be arrested. You know, by the time it got so bad that if you got married, they fired you from your job as a Malamed. The minute you had a wife and children to lose, you couldn't do it anymore. So the teachers were themselves students, because the student was single. I mean, so they were going to shoot him. So they killed one person. They didn't kill, you understand, a man and his wife and his children. It was so difficult. And the Mesiras Nefesh, if you read the stories of these Hasidim, it gets you so upset. It gets you so upset how terrible they were treated, but it also gets you so upset how reckless they were, how they threw away their lives, because they knew that this is what God wants now. You understand that God wants. This is what is necessary now. So the previous Rebbe made a Yom Tov, and we celebrate it every year. The Rebbe celebrated it every year, and we continue celebrating it every year. And of course the question is, what do we have in common with that world? And there's a lot of different things that I can tell you. But let me just put it to you in this way. You have a mention in Tanya. What the Rebbe says in Tanya, a very interesting thing. At the end of chapter 25, I believe, the Alter Rebbe talks about Mesiras Nefesh. He talks about this topic. The idea that a Jew gives his life for Yiddishkeit. And he says that when the Jewish people went into Israel, Moshe Rabbeinu taught them to say every day, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right, to declare the unity of God. Shema Yisrael has many ideas, but one of the most basic and important ideas of Shema Yisrael is Mesiras Nefesh. Shema Yisrael is a declaration of I am ready to give my life for the unity of God. That's what it amounts to. Krishma, Shema Yisrael, is a declaration of Mesiras Nefesh. So the Alter Rebbe asks a question. Jews are going into Israel. They're going to be sovereign. They're going to govern themselves. They're going to own the land. They're not going to have hostile neighbors. So why do you have to talk about Mesiras Nefesh when you're going into an environment of peace? If the Jews are coming into Israel, and they're going to conquer the land, and they're going to sell the land, and their lives are going to be materially and spiritually comfortable, why are you talking about Mesiras Nefesh? And Alter Rebbe says a very, very interesting and important answer. Alter Rebbe says when you live in a time of Mesiras Nefesh, you don't got to talk about it, you got to do it. when you don't live at a time of Mesiras Nefesh, you must talk about it. Because talking about it reveals to those of us living in America who we really are. Where our real strength is. How powerful Yiddishkeit is. To be a Jew in America is not very costly. In fact, it's quite respectable. It's quite rewarding. But the sacrifice reveals the potency of our own soul. In other words, if I never face a situation where being a Jew is very expensive, I need to know about my grandfather and my grandfather's grandfather who paid a high price for Yiddishkeit so that I should value what I have. We tell this story because this story informs our lives as we live in America. And thank God we're living in a place where being a Jew is free. Doesn't hurt, doesn't cost, it's not expensive, it's not dangerous. To the contrary, we're supported by the government in so many ways. We have to remember who we really are. Just like we tell the Hanukkah story every year, and it fortifies us. We tell the story of Beis Thomas because it really is. It's a recent version of the Hanukkah story. A handful of Jews, not a very large group, who defied one of the largest empires in the world with no belief that they could win. With no belief that they could win, just with the understanding that this is what you have to do. And that has to make us understand, how Jewish am I? How Jewish are you? How Jewish are you? How much fire is there inside of me? And you know what the answer to that question is? I never want to know. I don't want to know. I don't want to be tested and have to go so deep to find that strength. But I need to know that this is there. Because it motivates our lives as Jewish people today in Artas Avocha, in a comfortable place, that we should be Jews properly, that we should be Jews with priority and iker. It should be the most important thing. You know, one of the great dilemmas of American Jews is that Yiddishkeit is very, very important, but a lot of other things are also very, very important. And you never stop it, you just stop paying attention to it. You know, what do you invest most of yourself in? And the answer to that question is what you value the most. Now when someone is going to kill you for Shabbos, somehow Shabbos becomes very valuable. But if Shabbos becomes something that takes no effort, you can stop thinking about Shabbos. And slowly, very, very slowly, becomes less meaningful and less meaningful. And you don't really stop doing it, it just loses its energy. This is why this day is important to us, not just as a historic event, but as a message, as a lesson in our lives. It's the lesson of what is a Jew and what is Judaism. We're the next generation. We live in a different world. We have different tests. And in some ways our tests are more difficult than their tests in terms of the temptation, in terms of the assimilation. We need to draw strength from their example and translate that into our version to be passionate Jews. And that's why we have this celebration, 97 years on. We celebrate Yud B'S Tammuz. Okay? Now we have to daven mincha. 22 is mincha. Yeah? Okay, so if someone wants to ask a question until they say Ashrei, you can ask a question. But when they say, I didn't daven mincha yet, so I need to daven, go ahead.
You said you don't want to see at the same time. You said that we have to translate it. And we have to really somehow translate it for these days.
Kasas Lamoy, my friend.
Right. Exactly. I'm saying, like, so what, you're saying you don't want to see, but at the same time we have to see.
You want the energy, but you don't want the pain and the suffering. Yeah? Okay.